Shirley Donovan stood at her living room window, watching the spring breeze ruffle the leaves on the rose bushes along her fence. The house, once filled with children's voices and laughter, was now empty and seemed too big for her. Jack was supposed to come over today to help with the garden. She'd gotten him used to coming over on Saturdays to trim the bushes, sweep the yard, and do other things she couldn't do anymore. When Shirley first saw him in Agnes's cafe, he seemed remarkably mature for his age. Tall, with carefree curls, a tanned face, and slightly sad eyes, Jack was different from the local teenagers who still played ball in the yards. She'd learned that his parents had died in an accident when he was 10, and since then, he'd lived with an aunt who hadn't cared much for him. Life was rolling along for him on its own, and Shirley was caught up in something. He reminded her of her own sons when they were teenagers, the ones who now lived in other states and only came for the holidays. She decided to offer him help. Not just payment for work, but something more. Maybe the support she herself had once received from neighbors and acquaintances when she found herself in dire straits. She told him about college, offered to pay for the preparatory courses, even picked up a few brochures, explaining what prospects it might open up. Jack smiled and thanked her for her kindness, but he kept going to Agnes's cafe. Agnes Henderson lived on the other side of town, but their paths crossed often. For years, she had run a small cafe that served the best coffee and the freshest pies, and Shirley often went there when she was downtown on business. The two women had known each other since high school, but there had never been a friendship between them. Once upon a time, long ago, they had both had a crush on the same guy, Peter Raymond, who eventually preferred Agnes. Shirley married later, went away for a few years, and when she returned, she learned that Peter had died of a heart attack, leaving Agnes a widow. Now that their paths had crossed again through Jack, Shirley noticed a renewed rivalry in their long-standing relationship. It was an implicit, unspoken feeling. But whenever she saw Agnes playfully rub Jack on the shoulder or treat him to a specialty pie, jealousy flared up in her soul. Shirley knew that Jack worked hard in the cafe, and it annoyed her. It seemed to her that the guy was just wasting time instead of working on his college preparations. She didn't understand why he kept coming there, even though he had so much more to offer if he accepted her help. On this day, when Jack showed up at her gate, she decided to have a serious talk with him. "How are you doing, Jack?" she asked when he was already kneeling in front of the bush and beginning to prune the old branches. "Everything's fine, Miss Donovan," he replied, throwing a brief glance at her face and returning to his work. "I'll finish up at the cafe a little later today. We're having a party there tonight. Need to get the room ready." Shirley felt an unpleasant burning sensation in her chest. "Oh, Agnes is having a party?" she said with a little coldness. "What does she keep you so busy with? She doesn't pay you like I do." "Yes, but I like working at the cafe," he said calmly without pausing. "And then it's fun to talk to people, to hear their stories." She was struck by this calmness, as if everything she did for him didn't matter, as if Agnes was more important to him than she was to herself. She looked at his tanned neck, at the hands that deftly trimmed the branches, and suddenly realized that she didn't want to let him go to that cafe. But what could she do? "Well, if you like it there so much," she said at last, trying to hide the resentment in her voice, "why don't you ask her to help you get in? I hear she has connections at the university." Jack raised his head and finally looked at her. "I know you want to help me, Miss Donovan. I appreciate that. It's just, I have other plans right now." Shirley felt as if he'd just dismissed her as an unnecessary thing. Her face tensed, but she only nodded. "Of course, Jack. If you change your mind, you know where to find me," she said demurely and walked off into the house, leaving him to finish his work. Later, when Jack had finished and left, Shirley sat at the window for a long time, staring at his distant silhouette. She couldn't help thinking about the party at the cafe and how Agnes would be there, surrounded by guests, and Jack would be there to help her. It was a haunting feeling, and at some point she made up her mind that she would go to the party even if no one invited her. More and more often, Shirley noticed her neighbors and acquaintances begin to squint at her as she walked down the street or entered a store. She was greeted, but the glances were accompanied by a slight look of bewilderment or a hidden chuckle. After her conversation with Jack at her house, this feeling only intensified. It seemed the whole town was discussing her relationship with the 18-year-old. Shirley couldn't understand what people were saying behind her back, but she knew that in a small town, conversations about Jack's age and the attention she was getting could snowball. It annoyed her that some ridiculous assumptions were being made about their relationship. Things got even worse when she found out that Agnes was also at the center of these discussions. She had overheard a conversation in a drugstore when two women were discussing how Agnes often took Jack out to dinner and left him late at the cafe. "It seems that young men are now interested in older women," one of them said, and she and her friend laughed quietly. Shirley felt her face flush. They made it sound as if she and Agnes were competing for Jack's attention, just as they had competed for boyfriends when they were younger. She ran out of the drugstore without buying what she had come for, and she could hardly suppress the urge to go to Agnes immediately and demand an explanation. These rumors undermined her confidence and made her feel stupid. Later, standing in front of the mirror, Shirley looked at herself again. Her face still had pleasant features, and despite the wrinkles, she still boasted a slender figure. But now there was uncertainty in her gaze. Was this rivalry really about Jack? Or did it involve something deeper that she didn't want to admit? Shirley couldn't help thinking back to the days when she and Agnes had been at school. Then, too, everything had been shrouded in a secret tension. And again, the image of Peter Raymond came to her mind's eye. He was handsome and the girls crowded around him, but Agnes was Shirley's only real rival. When Peter started courting Agnes, it felt like a stab in the back. Shirley had done everything she could to get his attention. She still remembered the party at which Peter had asked Agnes for a slow dance, as if in mockery of her feelings, and she had stood back and felt the deep ache of jealousy burning in her heart. After so many years, the same feelings resurfaced again. Agnes was once again the center of a man's attention, albeit a much younger one, and again it looked as if she wanted to prove that her age was no barrier to attractiveness. When Jack stopped by her house again the following week to help with the garden, Shirley decided to ask him a few questions. "Jack, I've heard that you often stay out late at the cafe," she began, trying to keep her voice casual. "Do you have anything you do there besides work?" He looked a little surprised by her question. "Well, Miss Donovan, sometimes Agnes invites me to dinner," he answered quietly, shaking his hands off the ground. "She says I shouldn't spend money on food when she can treat me to something delicious." Shirley felt her irritation rising. "Do you eat dinner with her often?" She tried to keep her voice low and non-judgmental, but Jack picked up a hint of jealousy. "A few times a week, when I get a chance. She's a good cook," he said with a slight smile, something playful in his eyes. That look made Shirley wonder. Was Jack naive, or did he know the influence he had over women and was taking advantage of it? The more she thought about it, the more her anxiety grew. Meanwhile, Agnes was also beginning to suspect that Shirley was taking some steps to get Jack on her side. One evening, when Jack was cleaning the kitchen of the cafe, she came up to him and said, "I hear Miss Donovan is going to pay for your college courses. Isn't that a little generous for just helping out?" Jack looked up and shrugged innocently. "Well, she just wants to help me, doesn't she? I'm grateful, but I haven't decided what I'm going to do next." Agnes looked at him intently, as if she were trying to read his mind. "Just be careful, Jack. Nothing in life comes easy. At some point you'll have to pay for everything." Her voice sounded warning, though she didn't specify to whom she was referring. Jack remained silent, but something stirred inside him that made him look at both women differently. He was flattered by their attention, and he realized that each of them expected something in return for their help. He didn't need to be a genius to realize that the women saw him as more than just an object of support. And that opened up certain possibilities for him. The more Shirley and Agnes became involved in their silent struggle, the sharper their remarks to each other became. At one of the fairs where everyone gathered on weekends, Shirley noticed Agnes playfully patting Jack on the shoulder as she handed him a pie to taste. "You've become a master baker, Jack," Agnes said loudly enough to be heard by Shirley, who was standing nearby. "Maybe you'll open your own bakery someday." Shirley, who heard this, couldn't resist and came closer. "Yes, baking pies is a great future. But Jack, you want more than that, don't you?" she said with a smile that was more than just friendly. Jack looked at both women, as if weighing which position to take. It was almost like entertainment to watch them try to outdo each other in their attention to him. And he liked the fact that every word he said, every action he took, could set off a new round of tension. Rumors, meanwhile, were only growing. Some even claimed to have seen Shirley waiting for Jack late at night outside her house when he returned from the cafe. Others said that Agnes had spent long hours with Jack behind the closed doors of her establishment, discussing something important. The town was buzzing with gossip, and their hidden duel was heating up with renewed vigor. Agnes felt her heart clench whenever Jack started talking about plans to help Shirley. It annoyed her that Shirley had so much more to offer him than she did. But what made her angriest was the way Jack looked at her, as one of the possibilities rather than the only one who really cared about him. Shirley, for her part, noticed that Jack was becoming more aloof by the day. He was less and less likely to accept her offers to work for her, finding more and more reasons to refuse. Her suspicions were growing, and one day she heard two women in a cafe whispering that Agnes was keeping a young man close to her so he wouldn't leave. Suddenly, these words became all too clear to her. Jack was not as simple as he seemed at first sight. He might have been toying with both, knowing that each was willing to offer more to keep him to herself. The evening was noisy, just as Agnes had promised when she announced the upcoming party at her cafe. The small establishment, usually quiet and cozy, was now filled to capacity. The soft light from the lamps decorated with fabric lampshades streamed through the room, mingling with the music of the jazz ensemble, invited especially for the evening. The air was saturated with the smell of freshly baked bread, roast, and wine. All this created a warm, almost homely atmosphere. It seemed that the whole town had gathered to see Agnes reassert her importance and draw attention, including to Jack. Jack was the center of attention. He moved between the tables, helping to serve the guests and maintaining casual conversations. His broad smile and easy jokes instantly won sympathy, and many women, regardless of age, were happy to pick up on his words. But his gaze often lingered on two women, Agnes and Shirley. They were like two poles, each attracting him in its own way, and that seemed to be exactly what he wanted. Shirley showed up later than most of the guests, but her entrance didn't go unnoticed. She had chosen an elegant dress of deep green that accentuated her figure, and a gorgeous cape adorned with white feathers hugged her shoulders. These feathers moved with every step she took, creating an impression of lightness and grace. Tension seemed to hang in the air with her appearance. Agnes noticed her entrance and instantly tensed, though she tried not to betray her feelings. Jack was the first to approach Shirley, handing her a glass of champagne. "You look stunning, Miss Donovan," he said with a slight smile, something playful in his eyes. "You look like you've decided to outshine everyone else at this party." Shirley smiled back at him, but her gaze was fixed on Agnes, who was watching them from the bar. "Only those who try to hold on to their youth by force," she said sarcastically, but keeping her eyes on Jack. Agnes heard this and felt her hands clench into fists. She quickly moved away from the bar and went to the other side of the room, pretending to check the service on one of the tables. She tried to hide her irritation, but it didn't escape the gaze of several of the guests who were now watching the situation unfold with interest. The party continued, and the tension between Shirley and Agnes was becoming more and more obvious. The guests noticed how the women were literally trying to outdo each other. Agnes drew attention to herself by talking about how Jack worked at her cafe, how she helped him with advice and supported his endeavors. Shirley, on the other hand, mentioned her offer to pay for his courses and, by the way, talked about the opportunities that might open up for him in the future. Their conversations became more and more barbed, and their comments became caustic allusions to each other's shortcomings. Jack found himself in the middle of this silent duel. He had to maneuver between the two women, playing along with one or the other. He joked with Agnes when she offered him a taste of her specialty and readily responded to Shirley's invitation to dance. It was as if they were watching a show in which the two actresses were playing the lead roles, and Jack was the prize they were competing for. As the evening grew late and the champagne flowed, the atmosphere began to heat up. Shirley, slightly tipsy, approached Jack again and took his hand. "Come on, Jack," she said, leaning toward him and adding quietly, "I want to talk to you about your future. You shouldn't spend all your time baking and eating lunch." Jack obeyed, but their conversation was interrupted by Agnes, who suddenly approached them and said with a smile, "Shirley, I realize you need attention, but Jack's been on his feet all evening. Let him rest." The words sounded like a reproach, and it was evident on Shirley's face. She took a step back, but her eyes blazed with anger. "Yes, of course, Agnes," she replied. "The thing is, I'm not used to resting when there are young people to guide. But of course, if you have something more important for him, I won't get in the way," Agnes was about to reply. But at that moment, one of the guests called out to her, and she left Jack and Shirley reluctantly. Until the very end of the party, the women continued to have a hidden conflict that could easily have escalated into an open quarrel, if it had not been for the presence of others. Around midnight, Shirley left the cafe, hardly able to keep from throwing one last sarcastic comment at her old acquaintance. Agnes gave her a look that was more than just resentment. The next day, the whole town was abuzz with news again. Agnes was found dead in the kitchen of her cafe. At first, the police leaned towards the accident version, a gas leak that could have been caused by faulty equipment. However, the circumstances soon began to look suspicious. The equipment had been checked not so long ago, and it was unlikely that such a serious breakdown could have occurred overnight. Jack, like many others, was in shock. He was called in for questioning as he was one of the last people to see Agnes alive. He told detectives that he had stayed up late into the night helping her close the cafe. He claimed he left when everything had been cleaned up and Agnes was left alone to finish her last drink. His voice sounded calm, but there was a hidden fear in his eyes, as if he realized that his words could be misinterpreted. Next up for questioning was Shirley. Her demeanor immediately seemed overly confident to the detectives, as if she knew what to expect from her and had prepared her answers in advance. She claimed that she had left around midnight and that she had not spoken to Agnes at all, except for a few words at the party. As the detectives examined the scene, one of them noticed a small white feather caught on a gas faucet. The feather looked out of place among the dirt and dust in the kitchen, and it immediately attracted attention. The investigation took a new turn when it was discovered that Shirley had been wearing a feather-adorned costume to the party. Rumors, of course, started again. The townspeople said that perhaps Agnes and Shirley had quarreled that night, and Shirley might have returned to deal with her rival. The detectives began to put the pieces of the puzzle together, and more questions arose about Jack and his role in the story. Tension reigned in the town. Shortly after the tragedy, residents who usually greeted each other in the street now slowed their steps to whisper about what had happened. Agnes's cafe was no longer frequented for breakfast as it used to be. Its doors remained closed. The place that had once been the heart of the small community was now surrounded by silence, as if the memory of the dead owner was a burden. Detectives Hunt and Miller had come from a neighboring county. Both had extensive experience in crime investigation, and what at first glance might have appeared to be an accident made them wary. They were particularly drawn to the details with the feather found in the kitchen and the rumors, which turned out to contain more facts than one might have guessed. "We start by interviewing witnesses," Hunt said quietly, jotting down addresses on a notepad. "Especially those who were at the party." Miller nodded, considering what he had heard. "I'll talk to Shirley Donovan," he added. "They say that she and Agnes have had a long history of friction." Shirley met the detectives with emphasized calmness, but her eyes showed tension. She chose her words deliberately as she described the events of the evening, and seemed to have prepared her answers in advance. "I left around midnight," she said, not taking her eyes off the detectives. "It was getting late, and I didn't want to stay out late." "What about your relationship with Miss Henderson?" Miller asked. "We'd heard there had been some friction between the two of you." Shirley frowned slightly, and her gaze hardened. "We'd known each other since we were young. Yes, there were frictions, but that was a long time ago," she replied. "For the last few years, we were just acquaintances." As the conversation progressed, however, the detectives noticed that Shirley tried to avoid mentioning Jack. As soon as the conversation touched on the young man, her answers became more restrained and streamlined. This did not escape Miller's notice, and as they left her house, he shared his suspicions with Hunt. "She's hiding something," he said. "Perhaps jealousy of Agnes, or even of Jack." Jack, too, came to the detectives' attention. The young man met them with a smile, but its strain was easy to see. He told them that he had indeed helped Agnes close the cafe after the party, but had left as soon as he had finished cleaning up. Agnes offered me to stay and have a drink with her, he said, looking away. But I refused. I had to go home, I was tired. Can you describe what she looked like at that moment? Hunt asked, trying to pick up on the subtle changes in his answers. Jack hesitated, as if he didn't know what to say. She looked a little upset. Tense, perhaps. He paused and added, "But it's been a long day, hasn't it? The detectives certainly weren't going to let Jack off the hook on this one." Hunt continued, "We know that there was a certain animosity between Miss Henderson and Miss Donovan. Do you know anything about it?" Jack sighed and shook his head slightly. They always kept aloof from each other, but I've never heard of them quarreling openly. Perhaps it's just a rumor. Though his answers were calm and measured, Hunt picked up some insincerity. Jack seemed to be trying to make the situation seem as harmless as possible. "One more question, Jack," Miller interjected. "We were told that you and Agnes spent a lot of time together in her cafe. Could she have said anything unpleasant about Shirley?" "Well," Jack lowered his gaze slightly. "Agnes sometimes expressed her displeasure that Miss Donovan tried to help me too often. She thought it unnecessary." When the detectives had finished their questioning, Miller remarked, "The guy either doesn't know anything or is carefully hiding it." Hunt only nodded in response, deep in thought. Meanwhile, new details about the women's past were coming to light. The locals willingly and even with some pleasure shared stories about the rivalry between Agnes and Shirley. Some claimed that they had always been jealous of each other, of Peter Raymond's success as a young man, of Shirley's later marriage, and even of their difference in wealth. Gradually, the picture became more and more grim. The dislike between them was not only part of the rumors, but also a hidden conflict that had grown stronger over the years. One of Agnes's old friends, Mary, shared with the detectives that she had heard Agnes make some rather unflattering comments about Shirley. She recalled how the night before the party, Agnes had complained that Shirley kept up with her even in her old age. It was an old pain, rekindled anew because of Jack, who found himself the unwilling object of the fight. When Hunt and Miller interviewed more witnesses, it turned out that Jack had been alone with both women frequently over the past few months. This supported the theory that each of them wanted to win his favor. At the same time, witnesses began to share observations about the oddities in Jack's behavior after Agnes's death. He seemed to be too calm, and even when talking about the deceased, his voice sounded cold. The detectives began to suspect that there was something more behind his seeming equanimity. Confirming their suspicions was information from Jack's aunt, who said that the guy had been surprisingly busy lately. She couldn't explain exactly what he'd been doing, but she'd heard him on the phone several times, and his voice sounded strained. Soon, Hunt and Miller called Jack in for questioning again, this time more insistently, asking questions about his relationship with Agnes and Shirley. Jack tried to answer honestly, but his answers became more and more streamlined, and some phrases contradicted what he had said earlier. "Are you sure you left right after cleaning up?" Hunt insisted. "We've got reports that someone saw you returning to the cafe later that night." "That's impossible." Jack tried to keep his composure. "I was at home." His reaction aroused even more suspicion. Hunt noticed the way the boy's shoulders jerked nervously when he heard about the man who'd supposedly returned. It seemed that Jack was afraid his words might call his alibi into question. Meanwhile, the detectives were digging deeper into Shirley and Agnes's identities, looking for documents, old photographs, and correspondence. Gradually, they discovered that their rivalry did not only concern the past with Peter Raymond, but also later events. For example, in their correspondence, one could find remarks concerning Agnes's business, which Shirley criticized for her commercial greed. Agnes responded by insinuating that Shirley was using her influence to appear more successful than she really was. Gradually, the detectives put together a picture where the jealousy and latent hatred between the women not only continued to exist, but also flared up with renewed vigor because of a young man to whom they both attached too much importance. The investigation continued, and with each new fact that surfaced, things only got more complicated. Hunt and Miller could not escape the thought that the events of that night had been carefully planned, but perhaps not by the person they had originally suspected. The feather found in the kitchen remained a key piece of evidence. Its origin was obvious, given Shirley's costume adorned with white feathers, but it didn't fit the scenario of an unintentional act. Was someone trying to frame her, or, alternatively, had made a mistake they hadn't had time to correct? The detectives knew they had to dig deeper to figure out how everything was connected. They called Shirley in for questioning once more, trying to catch her at odds. Hunt watched her reactions carefully, especially when he asked questions about who she had socialized with at the party and why she had decided to leave so early. Shirley claimed that there had been no conflict, although the tension between her and Agnes was indeed palpable. But her explanation seemed too well prepared, as if she had thought out every word in advance. After the interrogation, Miller remarked, "She has nerves of iron, but there is something wrong with her story. I feel she's hiding something, but that doesn't necessarily mean she's a murderer." Meanwhile, new facts began to emerge. The local engineering company that serviced the gas equipment in the cafe confirmed that the gas leak could not have happened on its own. The tap through which the leak had occurred had been tampered with in such a way that it was not visible on a cursory inspection. This clearly pointed to deliberate tampering. The question was, who exactly could have gotten close to the equipment to tamper with the leak? Agnes always kept the cafe in perfect order, and an outsider could not just walk into the kitchen without being noticed. Suspicion once again fell on Shirley, but Hunt and Miller were cautious about jumping to conclusions. A little later, the detectives managed to find another piece of evidence that changed the course of the case. In a careful examination of the deceased's belongings, they discovered a small note hidden in a desk drawer. It had only one paragraph written on it. "Don't try to play my games. I know more than you think." The note was unsigned, but the handwriting was clearly not Agnes's. This led the detectives to believe that someone in the woman's entourage had tried to warn her, or perhaps threatened her. The detectives spent the next few days analyzing phone calls and correspondence, trying to reconstruct the chronology of events. What caught their attention was a phone conversation Jack had the day before the party. The recording was indecipherable, but by intonation and fragments of phrases, it was clear that he discussed something related to the cafe. When the detectives called him back in for questioning, Jack looked tired and tense. "Jack," Hunt began, "we know that the night before the party you discussed something important on the phone. Can you tell us who it was with and what it was about?" Jack didn't answer at once, as if weighing each word. "It was work-related," he said at last. "Agnes asked me to check some equipment in the kitchen because we were having minor problems with the ventilation. I tried to arrange it with the foreman. Why didn't you tell us about this before?" Miller wondered. Jack hesitated. "I just didn't think it was important. After all, there was nothing I could do to fix it." The detectives exchanged glances. That explanation sounded plausible, but they couldn't help but notice how nervous Jack was as he answered the questions. They decided to test one more aspect. Tell Shirley about the note found at Agnes's place and see how she would react. When she was called again, Hunt handed her a copy of the note. "Have you ever seen this message?" he asked. Shirley looked at the paper and her face darkened for a moment. "No, I haven't," she said, setting the copy aside. "And frankly, I have no idea who might have written it. Maybe one of her employees? I mean, she was a strict mistress." That was the moment when something clicked in Hunt's mind. He remembered that among the conversations with the locals, the opinion that Agnes was not just a hostess, but a real controller. Her pedantry and pickiness were well known, and it explained why Jack sometimes looked so depressed. But could he take such a step as murder to free himself from her tutelage? The answer proved more complicated. Detectives found a witness who remembered seeing Jack the day after the party. His hands were scratched, and his face looked pale and anxious. The boy had explained it away by saying that he had tripped and fallen on the path, but this incident was the final thread that led the detectives to the clue. Later, Hunt and Miller arranged another meeting with Jack, where they suggested he tell the whole truth before they had to produce the evidence. "We know that your relationship with Agnes and Shirley was much more than just work," Miller said, looking at Jack carefully. "You played the role of an obedient employee, but in fact you manipulated both women. Your involvement with them wasn't so innocent, was it?" Jack bit his lip, his eyes darting around the room as if he were looking for a way out. "Yes, I was involved with both Agnes and Miss Donovan," he admitted at last. "But I didn't kill her. I didn't need to do that." He explained that he had indeed taken advantage of the women's attention to gain various benefits. They both believed they were helping him, and each sought to outdo the other. Jack admitted that at some point it had become a game to him. He enjoyed the attention, and even fueled their feud by feeding each a drop of rumors about the other. Hunt and Miller, after reviewing all the facts they had gathered during their investigation, realized that the answer to the mystery still eluded them. They had evidence pointing indirectly to Shirley. The feather they had found, her tense behavior, and evidence of their feud with Agnes. But to prove her guilty of murder required more than mere conjecture. They returned to one of the most important pieces of evidence, the feather found in the kitchen. The theory that Shirley might have been at the scene and somehow faked the gas leak looked plausible, but it still didn't explain exactly how the leak had occurred or why it had happened that night. The detectives knew that the cafe had state-of-the-art equipment, and without deliberate tampering, a breakdown seemed unlikely. Hunt and Miller's eyes turned back to Jack. They were still uncomfortable with his nervousness in the interrogation and the inconsistencies in some of the details of his stories. Hunt decided to double-check what Jack had said about the ventilation problems he had allegedly discussed with the foreman the night before the party. Detectives contacted the gas maintenance company and received some surprising information. "We have not received any requests to replace the vents from Agnes Cafe," said a spokesman for the company. "None of our handymen had traveled there in recent months." This revelation got the detectives thinking, if the company didn't know there was a problem with the equipment, who was responsible for replacing it? When Hunt and Miller called Jack back in for questioning, they decided to start by asking him about the money Agnes had allegedly given him for repairs. "Jack," Hunt began, "we know that you were assigned to replace the valve on the gas cylinder. You told Agnes you'd done it, but nobody actually touched the equipment. Do you want to explain where the money went?" Jack frowned, his face darkening, and he looked away for a moment. "Yeah," he stammered, realizing there was no way out. "Yes, she gave me the money. I was supposed to take the tanks to the service, but—" He clenched his fists. "I didn't do it. I spent the money on something else." "What other things?" Miller squinted at him. "I skipped it," Jack admitted. "Just went to another town and spent it for fun. I thought nothing would happen, that everything would be all right." Hunt and Miller exchanged quick glances. Jack's answer explained a lot. He had indeed known about the problems with the equipment, but had concealed it and deceived Agnes by saying that everything was fine. There was an old cylinder in the kitchen with a faulty valve, which eventually started to leak. That was the cause of the gas leak and Agnes's death. But the question remained, how did Shirley's feather end up in the kitchen? Hunt decided it was time to talk to her again. When Shirley reappeared in front of the detectives, her face looked tired, as if she hadn't slept in a long time. Hunt and Miller informed her that they knew about the gas leak and that Jack never replaced the valve as he should have. "We realize it could have been an accident," Hunt began. "But then the question arises, what was your pen doing in the kitchen? You were there that night, weren't you?" Shirley remained silent for some time, her lips pressed together. "Yes, I was there. But I didn't kill her," she said firmly, her voice trembling with emotion. "Agnes and I had an argument in the kitchen after the party was almost over. I was a bit drunk and decided to say what I'd been saying for years. We started arguing and then it got to fighting. She was tugging at my clothes, and one of my feathers must have come off at that moment." "Why did you leave without telling anyone about the fight?" Miller asked, watching her reaction intently. "I had already said everything I wanted to say." Shirley grinned bitterly. "After the fight, I just walked out. You see, at that moment I felt it was pointless. No matter how much I hated Agnes, she wasn't worth my continuing on. I had another drink and went home." Those words were sincere. Hunt and Miller saw that Shirley was truly remorseful. She couldn't have known that in a few hours Agnes would be killed by a gas leak that Jack himself had caused by his own negligence. The investigation had come to an end. Hunt and Miller realized that Agnes's death was the result of a chain of mistakes and random events. Shirley had no direct intention of killing her, although their quarrel might have contributed to Agnes being in the kitchen when the leak started. Jack, by his irresponsibility, was an indirect cause of the tragedy. Jack was tried for fraud and negligence causing death, but was not formally charged with murder because it was not proved that he had deliberately caused the leak. Shirley managed to avoid charges, but she will have to live with this crime, knowing that her own actions also played a part in this tragedy. With the investigation complete, life in the town gradually returned to its usual rhythm, but changed. Agnes's cafe remained closed. The sign with the name, a little burned out from time, continued to hang as a reminder of what had happened. People walked past, quickening their steps, as if they wanted to get past a place that brought back dark memories. Jack had left for another city to make a fresh start. There were different rumors about his departure. Some said that he simply ran away out of shame. Others claimed that he never really cared about those who stayed here. Few people were surprised when, a couple weeks later, news spread around town that he had been seen in the company of a new girlfriend. Shirley began to appear in public less often. She no longer tried to draw attention to herself with youthful outfits or loud outings. Now she could only be seen in the mornings when she went out for a walk on the deserted streets. Her neighbors greeted her with a nod, but everyone knew the old Shirley who had once aspired to shine was gone.